Welcome to the Festival of Ideas Online. I'm Andrew Kelly and I'm director of the festival, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's discussion with Martin Sandbu, European economics commentator for the Financial Times. Martin has worked in academia and policy consulting and has advised governments and NGOs on natural resources and economic development. He's the author of 3 books on business ethics, the euro, and now The Economics of Belonging, a radical plan to win back the left behind and achieve prosperity for all, which we're discussing today. Thank you for joining us, Martin.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you say in the book that this is an unabashed defence of liberal centrism. Why is liberalism in decline? Liberal centrism in decline?
This is, of course, something we've been having a heated debate about, at least until the pandemic hit and we had more urgent things to discuss. And there's a big disagreement on whether is it an economic story or is it a cultural story, backlash against openness and immigration and so on. And I make an argument firmly on the economic side of this. It's not that culture doesn't matter. The opposition to liberalism and to the post-war international order, if you like, it takes a very cultural form. But my argument, and I try to set out why in the book, is that if you go down and kind of trace the roots of this, you'll find that those roots are economic. And I think it's important to have what seems like a bit of an abstract discussion because it matters for what sort of policies we try to adopt. So it seems to me that if I'm right, that an economic story is really what's causing even the cultural motivations against the liberal order, then fixing the economy may be our best hope of reducing some of this toxicity we've seen in Western politics and bring people back together.
I'll come on to the economics in a moment, but I wanted to, you talked about the toxicity in politics. We've had lots of talk about the left behind, the excluded, the growth of populism. We've had the growth of nationalism, nativism, the result of the EU referendum and the election of Donald Trump. Now, you talk about, in your book, extending this a bit into the end of belonging. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
I think many of these political phenomena you mentioned, Trump, Brexit, but also the rise of populism, both on the right and on the left, although mostly on the right, in a lot of European countries, all of that has something in common. And part of what it has in common is a story. It's sort of a story about usurpation, about loss of place, about loss of status. It's a group of people who say and are told by these politicians that the system is rigged against you. You are essentially betrayed by your own elites. Vote for us and we'll blow everything up and restore you to your rightful place. That's the kind of story at the core of all these movements. And I want to make the point that a lot of these people do indeed legitimately have reason to be angry and to be disappointed and to some extent to see the system as rigged against them. What the populist offer is not going to help that, but they have been doing well partly because they were the first to articulate that sense of lost status and of a system rigged against them. And what I call the end of belonging is what I think is a real economic phenomenon that's been going on for a good 40 years, which is, you could call it economic polarization. It's that our economies have developed in ways that leave not a majority maybe, but a large group of the population in an economic situation of low pay, insecurity, very often precarious work, powerlessness, disempowerment, low status. All of these things come together. And they are right to be angry about that because it's not a satisfactory condition to live in. It's not a decent way of life. And it wasn't always that way. So I contrast the end of belonging with the roughly 3 decades at the end of the Second World War. And populist movements express a lot of nostalgia for that era. All the talk about, let's say, making America great again, bringing things back to where they were, it's a nostalgia for that era. And there were some good things to be nostalgic for, in the sense that you saw 30 years of convergence, reducing inequality between people, both in incomes and in wealth, but also between different places within countries. Poorer places were catching up with richer places. All of this came to an end towards the late 70s, around 1980. And since then, you've either had stagnation or you've seen those mechanisms of convergence going into reverse, increased polarization. And that is an economic phenomenon. It has economic causes. And those at the sharp end of that have a right to be dissatisfied. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are not populist or extremist or anti-liberals to come up with a proper liberal centrist answer that actually addresses those grievances. We've sort of failed to do that for several decades, and that's why the populists started winning. And this book is an attempt to contribute to saying, what could this sort of a centrist radicalism, a radicalism in economic terms, but still centrist and liberal, what could that look like?
I'm going to spend most of the discussion on the solutions that you propose and so on, but I just wanted to talk about a couple of the economic factors that you mentioned, and they're not just economic factors, I think, but you talk about the first is about the growth of cities and the impact that's had on other areas. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes. The big thing that has been happening over the decades is that as technology changes, so does the productive structure of the economy. And what coincided with the end of belonging was the end of mass industrial employment. End of the late 70s is when employment in factories in absolute numbers peaks in every Western country, sort of around 1980 or a little bit before. Since then, it's been going downhill. And that's because it's not because manufacturing disappeared. There's a belief that the factories went to China or that East Asia stole manufacturing and so on. It's not really that true, because if you look at the production of manufacturing goods, actually Western countries kept increasing their production, the output of industry. It's just that they didn't need as many people anymore. And all of this started happening before globalization happened. So what took the place of industrial employment as a driver of the cutting edge, most productive jobs? High knowledge service industries, the sort of modern industries that happen to thrive in big cities. And this is a big difference. There are technological reasons why industry gave way to knowledge services. But one consequence of that is that the places where knowledge industries thrive are doing better, and the places that are particularly good for industrial jobs are in decline. And those are different kinds of places. The sort of scale of industry, the size of a factory, it all works very well for a mid-sized town. It can be spread easily across a national territory. Whereas cognitive, high knowledge, high productivity services, they tend to thrive in the bigger city, in the metropolis, in the capital. And that's exactly what you see. Until about 1980, you saw poorer areas catching up with richer areas, which tended to be the capital city, across most Western countries. Since then, you've seen that convergence stop or even go into reverse, with the richest capital cities in particular, but the richest cities now pulling away from the rest of the country. And, you know, the jobs go with that, lifestyles go with that, incomes divide accordingly. And I think in the end, you get cultural divides and political divides based on this. We talked about populism before. Most of the populist parties get a lot of their support in these areas that are increasingly lagging behind.
And one of the ironies you talk about there, which has always been a puzzle, is how often the criticism of immigration is stronger in the areas which don't have that many immigrants or people from elsewhere in them.
That's right. Immigration tends to go to the countries, the places where people want to pay for them, where there is job growth and so on. I mean, not exclusively, but to a large extent. And it's the big capital cities in particular that have the highest ratio of immigrants. London, New York, Paris. The economic centers are also where immigrants tend to go. And those are also the areas that are doing reasonably well economically, and people learn to live with one another.
And then another thing you point to is about different levels of education and the difference this makes to feeling included or excluded.
That's really important, and it's another consequence of this one deep fact that I mentioned, that the productive structure of the economy has changed. In the industrial economy, you didn't need a lot of formal education to get a decent job on the assembly line, and there were a lot of those jobs. Today, the best paid jobs require quite a lot of formal education, abstract thinking, cognitive skills, also soft skills, social skills, in a sense, in a stereotypical way, sometimes more feminine skills, if you like. Not that only women can have them, but that's kind of how we've thought about them traditionally. Even in manufacturing, the jobs that remain that are good ones require quite a high level of skill. And it's not only manufacturing. In the book, I mentioned the example of roughnecking, people on oil rigs, people working on oil rigs. That used to be a sort of very manual job. It's now all done. A lot of it is done by robots, and you need to be, skilled enough to control a robot to do that sort of job. It's a better job. It's a cleaner job. It's a less tiring job. It's probably a better paid job. But you're not going to get it walking straight out of high school.
So you've got the economics of belonging, and you propose a new economics of belonging, and you do contrast early on in the book, right from the start, really. In the year 1933, you contrast Franklin D. Roosevelt with Hitler, Adolf Hitler, and the different approaches to renewal there. Tell us about the new economics of belonging, and what made you think of that?
Well, starting from the fact that the economics, the economy of belonging came to an end, and that is at the root of our political divisions. As I said, my argument is, well, then we should at least try to see if we can restore an economy of belonging. What that doesn't mean is to try to recreate something that existed 50 years ago. We can be as nostalgic as we like, and there were, of course, problems in the 50s and 60s too. People were excluded, but things were going in the right direction, because it so happened that the industrial economy lent itself quite well to that. But you're not going to get that by trying to increase a lot of low-skilled industrial jobs. It's just not going to work. What you have to do is to try to find a way to make this convergence happen again, but working with the grain of technological change and what the productive structure is like now. So it's not about restoring the jobs of old. That will not help. It's not even, although that may be part of it, but it's not primarily about redistributing from those that have the good jobs now to those that don't. It's really about trying to find a way in which productive jobs can be accessible to a larger part of the population, and in particular, more of the country territorially. How can we have these cutting edge, high knowledge service jobs, not just in the capital cities, but in many more places around countries? So it's about, if you like, trying to come up with more of an equality of productivity, so that everyone can actually go into a job, be productive, get rewarded for that, rather than either be left by the wayside of economic change or simply end up subsidized and always never feel independent. So that's kind of the core idea, and we will talk about what that can mean in practice. But the goal has to be not to turn the clock back, not to hold back time, not just to compensate for changes, but to really try to bring policy on board with how the productive structure has changed and try to make that productive structure work for everyone. And just to add one more thing, these technological changes keep happening. We've talked about the loss of industrial jobs, factory, assembly line jobs. But of course, computers got rid of a lot of clerical jobs. And digitization and the internet is getting rid of a lot of retail jobs. And more will come. This will keep happening. And the risk is that it's the same group of people who keep being hurt every time by these changes. So we really need to make these changes work for everyone.
So let's talk about some of the changes. Let's start with the two areas we've just discussed: education and cities. What do we need to do about education for this new economics of belonging?
In some respects, the European Nordic countries are a bit of a model. They have their problems too, but probably better than most other countries. They have navigated these economic shifts of the last 30, 40 years very well. And by the way, these are some of the most open economies in the world. It's clearly not because of globalization that you cannot try to sustain an economy of belonging. And a couple of things they're very good at. One thing is that they are really very good at making sure that their populations are skilled. So they have the highest scores in terms of literacy and numeracy skills, these sort of general skills that allow workers to adapt, to learn new skills, to learn how to use machinery, to work with technological change rather than be hurt by it. So that's crucial. And there's a reason why they manage that. It's because they spend money on it. So Denmark and Sweden and Norway have some of the highest share of GDP spent on education at all levels, public spending on education of all rich countries. So, to some extent, you get what you pay for. That's one part of it. What they also do, and this is maybe less well known, they make it quite easy to move from one job to another. So in all of Europe, the two countries with the highest rate of job churn, the highest rate of job-to-job change, are Denmark and Sweden. So they don't want to keep people, protect jobs that are threatened by technology. They want workers to be able to move to better, maybe more automated, more skill-intensive jobs, because those jobs are more productive and therefore can pay more. So those go together. Readying people as much as you can to be adaptive, readying them for technological change and for productivity increase, and then setting up an institutional framework that allows the shift from one job to another.
Thank you. The second area is about cities and towns, I guess, because one of the debates here in this country is about the growth of cities has sometimes been at the cost to the towns, really. And your own newspaper did the most remarkable essay on Blackpool, I remember, which you mention in the book. And you've written about this a lot in the Financial Times. How do we solve this problem of first of all, renewing those left behind towns, however you describe them, and secondly, encouraging them more to work, which I guess is one of the aims with the wider metropolitan area and the cities as well?
Yes. It's a problem from hell, really, because we have the field tilted against us, if you like. The economy, as I explained earlier on, the nature of where high value-added production is now is in the activities that do particularly well in the big cities. So it's not easy. We should start by admitting that. And there isn't one policy that will fix it. You need a lot of things to go right at the same time. But you mentioned Blackpool, and one thing that comes out of my colleagues' reporting from there is how there are people who leave, but it's the highest skill, the ones who can get those plum jobs in the big city, they leave. Whereas those who kind of fall through the cracks elsewhere often end up almost washed up in those left behind towns. So there's this self-enforcing mechanism of decline, and that obviously has to be broken. Now, there are many things that have to work for that to happen, but it is possible. And I think we need to think very ambitiously about this. I try to distinguish in the book between three ways you could think about the problem of regional disparity. One is a sort of strategy of reversal, this hope that actually you can hold on to these jobs. You should get the old industrial jobs back, the old assembly line jobs back. I think that will never work. Maybe you can stave off decline for a little bit, but the restructuring just becomes more and more expensive and more painful when it finally happens. So that's not really a sustainable strategy. The second way people sometimes look at it is what I call a strategy of connectivity. Okay, these are left behind places, try to plug them into the economic centers. So transport infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, all of these things. I think of that as a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Because connectivity, and as the case of Blackpool illustrates, it might just make it easier for those with the most skills to leave, for example. And even physical connectivity isn't enough if you don't have the social connectivity that allows people to actually get the jobs that could technically, coding you could do from anywhere, right? We are learning now that we can do a lot of things from lots of places. Maybe this will make for a change. But still, the people living in these areas have to be equipped to both get those jobs and do those jobs. So I think we need to be much more ambitious and go for the hardest task, which is what I think of as a strategy of attraction. So you want to try to make at least some of these places attractive in their own right for the jobs that now are the highest productivity, produce the highest value added. So you want to create new homes that are attractive for people who can do the high knowledge service jobs to want to do them there. I mean, that's very hard. And you need a lot of things at the same time. You need, of course, you do need the connectivity and the infrastructure. You need for these places to be nice places to live. And everybody knows this, right? You do surveys of what people in left behind areas what they want, what often comes up is that they want a really nice high street, like richer places have. A place where it's nice to live, whether you have cultural meeting places. So you need to think about public amenities like libraries and pools and what have you. And I think you need a critical mass of these jobs. So how do you do that? One way, and there's evidence that this works, is to try to make sure you place research institutions. So not just teaching universities or teaching colleges, but actual research institutions that kind of put that critical mass of knowledge jobs in a place that make it possible then to attract others. And so there are some case studies in the book of places that have worked. So one story I like is about Grand Rapids, Michigan in the US. That was a declining manufacturing area, managed to turn things around, not just adding jobs, but adding manufacturing jobs. But they did that by combining. They managed to attract a medical consortium. They managed to get old manufacturing firms to switch. There's this wonderful anecdote of one that switched from producing something like cling film into high-grade medical wrapping. You know, a much more difficult thing to produce, but you can see how it was based on existing skills. But you can do that because you're near and you can work with, and the local government can bring together those who have the high knowledge skills for what is necessary. Two more little things. One is you need the right collaboration at all levels, both from the local to not just the national, but the global. So you need the national government to put in the right resources. You need the local leadership to identify what can work, what are the skills you can build on, what are the local values you can build on. But you need to be open to the world. So if your strategy is some very specialized manufacturing, it could be services, but suppose it was very specialized high-tech manufacturing, you want a global market for that. So you don't get this strategy of attraction without being open to the world. So this is a bigger theme in the book. Globalization is not the enemy. It wasn't what caused the problem in the first place, although it's often blamed. And not only is it not a problem, it is part of the solution.
A third area I just wanted to discuss with you is about what's something which has come back into public prominence in recent years, and particularly now, is about universal basic income.
Yes.
And the potential that this might offer. You made the point in the book that it's not argued very well at the moment, but there is a case for it. Have I got that right?
That's right. I mean, I think that the discussions or the disagreements on universal basic income or negative income tax is a sort of different way of doing it, but it comes down to the same economically. It's too often assessed as an anti-poverty, a welfare policy. For me, it's not that. It's more of a policy for empowerment. It's really about giving everyone the ability to say no to unacceptable, indecent work conditions. And the reason why that's important is not just for this condition of belonging, feeling that you belong, you're not somebody who's excluded, left behind, treated as worthless, but because it's a spur to productivity. If workers are able to leave jobs that don't treat them well or that don't pay well enough, employers, businesses will have to step up their game. And this is a broader theme in the book. UBI plays into it, but there are other facets of it. In countries where a lot of people have dead-end, badly paid, insecure, precarious jobs, it's often because businesses can get away and find it profitable to do that. In the Nordics, for example, there's less of that because wages at the bottom end are so high that businesses just have to automate, become more productive so they can afford to pay higher wages. And something like UBI and the empowerment it affords workers, I think can have some of the same effect. You just have to up your game as an employer if your employee can leave, if they're not forced because they have no alternatives, if they're not forced to work with you like that. And the fact is that a lot of people don't have alternatives. A lot of people don't have any savings. We see from the debacle of universal credit in this country, but we've learned a lot about it actually in the COVID lockdown. A lot of people just don't have enough money to go for a week without a job. That makes it impossible to either retrain or to find a better job. You may not have the financial space or even the psychological space to improve your situation. So the current system creates these low-income, bad job traps that people themselves can't get out of. And I think a UBI is the one reform in the benefit system that could fix that.
We've talked about three of the policy ideas and changes. There are many more in the book, and we obviously encourage people to read the book. I wanted to talk just about a couple of other areas. You talked about this, the Treaty of Detroit and the social contract that was out there. Are you looking for some kind of social contract? I'm particularly thinking about the role of unions and nowadays. It was quite remarkable during the COVID-19 early days when the Conservative government started talking about what a good relationship they were having with the unions and so on. This was what kind of thing could result from that for you, do you think, of a new social contract?
Looking back at the history of the post-war decades, it's clear that the trades union movement was a big part of why the economy of belonging worked. The union movement itself, of course, was strong, partly because the economy was based on these industrial jobs where unions were strong. And as we know, in most countries, the Nordics are sort of the exception, they have declined significantly. The Treaty of Detroit, since you mentioned it, was the kind of name given to the collective bargaining deal between automobile workers, manufacturing workers, and the car companies. That basically fixed from around 1950 on the allocation of the increase in productivity growth. So as car companies became more productive, car factories became more productive, that productivity growth was taken out in sort of fixed fair shares between labor and capital. And that lasted for a couple of decades. But the way it happened in the US is different from the way it happened elsewhere. But in every country, you had this sort of thing. You had everyone sharing more or less equally in economic growth. And that was a social contract. I mean, a contract isn't a written down document, but it's an understanding of how the rewards and the fruits of growth are shared. And that broke down at the same time as the economy shifted away from the industrial economy. So we need to restore something like that. That's part of belonging, I think, is a shared understanding of who belongs and what does that mean in terms of what they get in material rewards, and not just economic, but political and social status. Unions can play a role in that, but they aren't always able to. And in many countries, union coverage has fallen so much that it's very hard for them to play that role. And in fact, it may sometimes be against their interest to represent workers at large rather than their own members, because then they sort of destroy the necessity for, destroy their own role. So if unions can play a constructive role the way they still do in the Nordics, I'm all for it. But I think we cannot wait for unions to be rebuilt. They may never be rebuilt, and today's economy makes it harder. If you think about the rise of gig work or otherwise fragmented, insecure contracts, it's not so easy. And there, I think policy and the government has to step in and try to fulfill some of the functions that unions have traditionally done. That partly means securing that the people at the bottom and some way up get good wage results. Minimum wages can do that. It partly means ensuring that there is a voice for workers, in particular the most marginalized ones. And it should represent the interest of working people in a way that even unions that are strong may not be able to do. I'm thinking, for example, in an economy where you should expect to change jobs much more often. It's not clear that a union that's linked to either a particular workplace or a particular sector will be able to do that if you're going to move between sectors. And for that, again, you may need different institutions, and they may have to come from the state. But you can imagine, for example, an idea is make it easier to passport, if you like, the entitlements and the rights you earn up in one job into other jobs, so that there's less difference between being a gig worker or a temporary worker and a permanent worker. I mean, that's the sort of thing that it may not be so easy for unions to do, or you would need a new union for it. But in the meantime, there's no shortage of policies that a government that has the political will could try to introduce.
And that brings me on to the final question I wanted to discuss with you, really, about political will and about leadership. And I come back to the way you started the book, particularly looking at Roosevelt compared to what was happening in Germany. I mean, how confident are you that either we have the politicians and the leadership that can make these changes happen, or that can be developed over the next few years. And linked to that is you talk about this is not a party political issue in a way. It's not left versus right. It could come from the centrist area, from either side, really.
I think that's right. I think there's a lot that I recommend that could sit well with a center-right party as well as with a center-left party. I finished this manuscript about the time when coronavirus was moving from China to Europe, it seems. So I had written this without realizing a pandemic was about to hit us. And already I was detecting a lot of support and demand for radical change. I was detecting the fact that the politicians and movements that claim to offer that, even if they may not have offered it for real, were politically successful. And the mainstream parties were unable to articulate something equally radical, but that maintains what's good about the liberal political democracy, market democracy. And now we have the pandemic. And what we have seen is that it turns out governments, led by centrists also, can be fantastically radical in a crisis of this magnitude. So the sort of economic policies engaged in everywhere, the furlough type schemes where salaries are subsidized at a very large scale, very few would have predicted that. I certainly wouldn't have predicted that sort of radical response. So I mean radical here in a kind of neutral sense of large scale, quick change. So I think we've learned that even centrists can be radical. I think we knew already, that's the argument I make in the book, that there's an appetite for radical change and that those who offer it are likely to be successful. And even before the pandemic, you started to see changes in that direction in the center. So take the UK government as an example. Boris Johnson was elected in December, had a 2-3 month honeymoon before the pandemic. And in that period actually shifted the Tory party into a direction, at least rhetorically, more in the direction of the sort of things I propose than what is a conventional conservative agenda. A much bigger spending on things like infrastructure, at least a rhetorical focus on people at the lower end of the pay scale and left behind areas. I mean, we don't know, and we'll find out how much of it is for real. But this was already happening, is my point. So I think that what I thought about the state of Western politics before the pandemic is even more true now and in a more urgent way, that there's a demand for radicalism, that it will be the radical proposals that will win because people are fed up and want change. And so the question becomes, what sort of radicalism is it going to be? It's not about will there be radicalism, it's what form will it take? And I think we really need ideas here for that radicalism being one that brings us all together rather than divides us more.
Well, your book's packed full of ideas. One quick question, actually. You refer in the book to being the recipient of a fellowship to write this book. Did that free you up from day-to-day journalism?
It certainly did. So, let me take the opportunity to give my thanks to the Friends Provident Foundation, who have a journalist fellowship, which is not very well known and should be much better known. So if any economic journalists are watching, they should look it up. It allowed me to take time off work in order to write this manuscript, and not just that, they were very supportive also in terms of content. So their purpose is to allow journalistic writers to write about ideas to improve the economy and make it work for everyone. And it was really of great help because while you do the day job, you can think about some of the same things. But everyone who's trying to write a book know that it's an awful job, and it's always much worse when you're in the middle of it than what you think when you start. So that was of great help, just to kind of spur me to do it and then free me up to have the time.
Well, thank you to them as well from us for giving you support, because you have written and published a remarkable book packed full of ideas for moving us forward. I do encourage everyone to read The Economics of Belonging. It's published by Princeton University Press, and it's available online from our partners at waterstones.com and in Waterstone shops around the country. So this is Festival Ideas Online. We've got more events coming up. Do check them out. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Martin Sandbu. Thank you very much.
Thank you.